What's up, guys? E-Drone here, and today we are going to be hooking up our XM Plus receiver, soldering it up to the build, and also we're going to be installing our new standoffs. Stay tuned.
Yep.
So I took a trip to my local hobby shop. Hey, how you doing, buddy?
All right.
And ended up getting this servo plug here, which we're going to use to connect to the receiver, and then we're going to directly solder the end of these leads to the flight controller. That way we can disconnect the receiver from the flight controller by just plug and unplugging it with a servo connector. So what needs to happen first is we're going to need to solder these 3 sets of pins to the receiver, and I'm going to be using the 90-degree bent pins for my install. That way they're going to sit flat in the build, and then we can just plug servo plug connector right into it. And once that's done, we are also going to be installing our new red standoffs. These are a little bit taller than the stock ones that come with the Martian 2, but they are in the red, which I like. And I'm going to put a link down in the description for these standoffs and the XM Plus receiver. This is not going to be down in the description, but you can find these online or at your local hobby shop. And I went to my local hobby shop. They charged me $250, which I don't think is a bad deal. It's got the 3 cables that I need: white for S-bus, black for ground, and red for power. Wanted to talk to you and go over some changes that I made on the frame, off camera, that is. And, you know, basically I had a comment, Alchemical Anarchist, I hope I said your name right, and he had mentioned that the reason that I was running out of space on my build was because I had put the 4mm arms on top of the bottom plate, and that was stealing an extra 4mm from me. And if you're on my Instagram, I did put up a little picture there of the stack all taken apart. And the reason that I took the whole drone apart is exactly because of that. I actually moved the arms from the top of the bottom plate to underneath, but I sandwiched them, if you can see that, I sandwiched them between the bottom plate and that extra piece of fiberglass that I have bought. There's one on the top which separates the PDB from the actual carbon fiber chassis, which is on the top there. And then I have bought another one, and I actually use that to kind of sandwich in these arms below the base plate. So this is going to make changing the arms a lot easier as well. And I'm going to show you the Wizard side by side so you can kind of see it's kind of the same construction. So as you can see, the Wizard's on the bottom, and you can see that the arms are beneath the bottom plate, sandwiched in between another bottom plate on the very bottom of the chassis. And there's also a plate on the top. So it's kind of like a sandwiched in design there, which is incredibly strong on the Wizard. And we've basically done the same thing on the Martian 2 frame. We just used that extra fiberglass insulated board to be the extra bottom plate. But you can see that's going to allow to have more room in the build. So that's going to give us an extra 4mm on the build. Not to mention, plus I got a little bit taller standoffs. So we have plenty of enough room for our VTX to go right on the top of the stack. And then I'm going to have the receiver behind here on the top, underneath the top plate. It's going to be sticking underneath the top plate. First thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to take our little pin header here, and we're going to need to figure out which way it needs to be facing. So this obviously is the top of the receiver here. And you can tell that because we have the bind button here and the LEDs over here. So these little pins are actually going to push right in there to the receiver, just like so. So now what we need to do is we need to flip over the receiver and get these pins lined up to where they're just underneath of the receiver. So there's just a little bit of wire sticking out. You don't want to go that far. That's just going to be way too much. So we need to find something to prop this up against with. So now you can see we have just a very small amount of the pin going through. Now what we want to do is take our soldering iron and touch right here on the pin and just heat up a little bit of solder to melt on that pad. Just like so. Get a nice little flow. Just like that. Don't need very much heat or a lot of solder to do that. So we do have three decent solder joints that are holding the pin headers on the receiver. So now we have the pin header on the receiver, just like this. So it's going to sit in the build just like this, flat. And then we'll be able to easily plug in our connector right there. So the next part we're going to have to do is we're going to need to take our servo plug here. We're going to have to figure out what length we need, cut the wires, and solder these three wires to our flight controller. So realistically, our receiver is going to be mounted right around this area here on the back of the copter. That way the antennas are going to come straight out the back. So as you can see, to get from the receiver to the flight controller, we're going to need to go to S-bus. We're going to need to go to our positive power and our ground. As you can see, we are not going to need hardly any wire at all. So let's just say the receiver is going to go right here. Move this back a little bit. Let's just say the receiver is going to be right around there. Our plug is going to plug in here. And now you can see that with the plug connected, with the pins connected, we can now plug in our servo to our pins now. Just like so. Plugs in. Now, it can plug in either way, so you have to make sure when you're plugging this in, you are plugging in the correct way with the correct wires lined up. So obviously the white is going to be our S-bus wire, our signal wire, the red's going to be power, and the black's going to be ground. We'll have to look at the layout of the pins to make sure that we plug this in the correct way. You don't want to plug it in the opposite way. You may damage your receiver. So realistically, just to give us a little bit of slack, I would say if we cut the wires right here, that would give us plenty of wire for this build. Looking at the diagram, this is the way it's facing with the antennas straight out the back. And here is our 3 pins here. And there is our 3-pin pad. And you can see down here, we have S-bus at the very top, 5-volt in the middle, and ground on the bottom. And if we were to rotate this plug so that the terminals are facing straight up, you can see we have S-bus on top, 5-volt in the middle, and ground on the bottom. So this is the configuration in which this has to be plugged in, just like that. Got our length, going to go ahead and cut. And never throw your wires away. This is some nice spare wire. You know, if you ever need a positive lead or a negative lead or a signal, this is decent wire that you can reuse. So now we have our length, and you can see this is going to be plenty long enough to reach that flight controller. Give us a little bit of slack, in case you want to pull the, the receiver, back out the back of the copter and that will give us the slack that we need. Which brings me to my next point. I told you that I had to disassemble the entire quad to move the arms. That would not have been possible without desoldering if I had not given myself extra slack on these wires. So all of my wires, I made sure I gave plenty of extra slack, and I actually had enough slack in my wires to pull up each one of these boards and actually get the arms unhooked from the bottom of the base plate and move them to underneath the base plate and sandwich in with the carbon or the fiberglass insulated board here. So can't stress that enough. Make sure you always leave yourself enough slack. I did have to pull back the ESCs just a little bit since I did move the arms, but that was all possible because once again I had enough slack in the build. So just keep that in mind. You know, it's nice to have a nice tight build and have the wires nice and tight and tidy, but when you go to have to take something apart, you're gonna have to desolder. The only way you're going to be able to take this apart without having to desolder is giving yourself that extra slack. Go ahead and got the wires split apart. Now we're going to go ahead and strip just a little tiny bit of insulation off to leave us enough wire to go ahead and solder onto our flight controller. Once you got your wires stripped, you know, you can use a tool or your fingernail. Sometimes your fingernail is actually easier because these wires are so small. But you want to make sure you keep these wires in the same order like that. And just make sure you give them a twist because you don't want to have any loose fray. Now we can go ahead and pre-tin these wires. Don't need much heat, as these wires are fairly small. The solder went all the way through the wire, so it's nice and tinned. Okay. So now we need to locate our S-bus, our ground, and our power for our receiver. So here you can see we have the S-bus, we have the 4-volt here, and the ground. This receiver takes 3.7 volts to 10 volts. So this power right here will be sufficient for our receiver. So what we need to do is go ahead and solder, pre-tin these pads right here. Next we have our power and our S-bus. So all you need to do is hold this right above ground and just give her a nice little tap. All right, there's our ground. And our S-bus. Just touch it real fast, and it should set up right for. So now you can double check and see that we have our ground here, our power here, and our S-bus here. So we have our wire soldered to our flight controller with our servo plug. We have our pins soldered to our receiver. But there's one more thing we need to do to this receiver before we install it, and that is to put some heat shrink on top of this to protect the components. And they did not include any heat shrink with the XM Plus, which is a little bit of a disappointment. But as you can see, the bottom is completely bare, and there's all your electronics there. So we don't want this to short out. So we need to have a protective heat shrink over top of this receiver. Now we're going to put this on here right about there because we don't want to cover up the bind button. So that's about where the heat shrink's going to stop, and then we're going to cut the heat shrink right before these pins, And that way we have a good solid connection. So just a little bit of that board is going to be left exposed, but not too much. Now I don't have a heat gun or anything like that, so what I'm going to do is cut this to size first of all, and then we're going to use my wife's blow dryer, which has like a turbo mode, and that's what we're going to do to heat this heat shrink up. You'll see, it works great. I've done it before. So I went ahead and cut this to length, and as you can see, it's just going to be right below the bind button there, so we have access to our bind button, and it's just going to come to the bottom of the black this plastic here on the 3-pin. That way it doesn't interfere with the servo plug plugging in for the receiver. So let's go ahead and get this hair dryer and I'll show you how it works. This part of the German build is brought to you in part by Revlon. There is no other. Just kidding, guys. Alright, so here is the hair dryer here. And the thing I like about this hair dryer, like I said, I don't have a heat gun or anything like that. But this has warm, cool, and hot. And if you turn this on hot, you see this little red button here? It's called turbo, and it really kicks this thing out and puts out some heat, enough to do a heat shrink. So let's go ahead and fire this bad boy up here. Turn on high. Oh yeah, now listen to the turbo kick in. Oh yeah, she's getting hot. So we're gonna go ahead and I'm gonna hold this up because I don't want it to melt to the my cover here, and watch the magic. It did work. It did shrink it up, and it's exactly where I wanted it, and it's going to protect our electronics. We can still have access to our bind button. Still see our LEDs, and we still have access to plug in our pin. So we're going to let that cool off. But yeah, that worked out great. So I'm glad that I hung on to the ESC heat shrinks that came with them, because they gave you some extras, and I was able to use that to kind of protect this receiver. But there you are. Hair dryer, the trick. We have our receiver with the heat shrink on. We've got our 3-pin soldered on. And we also have our servo plug lead soldered on to our S-bus, power, and ground. So now literally all we would have to do is just plug this in. Now the S-bus is always going to be on top. So we have to always remember when we plug in this, the S-bus is always on top of the receiver when it's facing this direction. So we plug it in just like that. And now, if we were to power this on, the receiver would now have power. And we can see we have plenty of extra wire, so we'll probably end up looping that back a little bit. And it's going to sit in the copter, you know, right around this general area with some double-sided sticky tape. Maybe even like a small zip tie to hold it to the top of the frame. And then these are going to be sticking out the back with some protective straws to protect these leads here. And, you know, you can also solder the wire directly to the receiver as well. But I wanted to have the option to be able to just kind of unplug this and have that option just to go ahead and unplug and get this thing to be able to take it off if I need to do firmware updates and stuff like that. I'll be able to actually remove the receiver now quite easily without having to desolder. And what I'll end up doing is getting a plug like this that will plug in here, and on the opposite end will actually be like this as well, and will plug directly into my Tyrannus X7 remote to do firmware updates on the actual receiver. So that's another reason it's nice to have this 3-pin on here. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and put the standoffs on here, the red standoffs, and we will almost be ready to start programming. However, there's one more thing I'm going to do before I put power to this, and that is going to be coming in the mail, and I should have it soon, but we're waiting on one more piece of this puzzle. That way we can get into programming and we can finish putting the top plate on, the camera mount, and all that. But we're going to go ahead and put these standoffs on and see how they look. It's important to note when you're going ahead and putting your screws on, make sure you get the right size Allen key, because if not, you're going to end up stripping it out. But you should have a very snug, tight fit when it comes to tightening these hex screws down. We got these standoffs put on, and I gotta say, I'm starting to feel a lot better about this build. Getting these standoffs on here is just one step closer to getting this thing done. And as much as I would love to just go ahead and power it up and just check everything, I must wait for this one extra item that's coming in the mail before I do that. And you will see exactly why I waited in the next video when we continue the last part of this build. And then we're going to hop into programming, because we have lots of programming to do on this build. We have to program the run cam split. We have to get it all updated with the newest firmware, get everything set in that. We have to program the flight controller with Betaflight and get all our settings set for that. We also have to program all the ESCs in BL Heli Suite. So that's going to be the next part, the next set of videos after I get this thing all put together is going to be the programming. So, and special shout out to Bill over at Coast to Coast Drones. Check him out. He's got a YouTube channel, also on Facebook. He's got his own Facebook page. Lots of helpful information. And I want to give him a shout out because he suggested, putting my build videos in a playlist on my YouTube channel. So that's exactly what I did. Thanks a lot, Bill, for the recommendation. And if you want to check out my build playlist, it's right there. It's actually under Race Drone Build, and if you click on that, it's got all my videos, including this one, to let you kind of know how I started with this from the very bare frame to where we are now. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and check out that playlist. You can I kind of walk you through step by step each part of this build. I thank you guys for watching, and please subscribe. And there's going to be more content on the channel, more giveaways, and lots more tutorials, information, and drone finished building and flights, if weather permitting. Right now the weather's been not so great, but hey, you know what, we got another special plan that's going to be happening this winter, and that's going to be another set of videos that we're going to do as well. Till next time, E-Drone out.